to know or to figure out where words begin and end. So this is an important challenge that we take for granted as adults. We don't have difficulty segmenting speech into words. But for the young infant, how do you attach a word to meaning if you have difficulty finding the individual words? The second challenge is there's a lot of variability in speech. Some of this variability matters and changes the meaning of a word. Some of it is not lexically relevant or non-phonemic. So how do infants figure out what's relevant and what's not relevant? And you can't really come hardwired for this because languages differ in how they use sound to communicate meaning. So lexical tone is a good example. Many of you probably speak Mandarin, where tone changes sometimes can affect the meaning of a word. And if you're a Mandarin-English bilingual, you have to accept that in English, tone changes certainly occur, but they don't change the meaning of a word. They don't change its lexical identity. Even within languages, there are speaker differences. We all have different vocal tracts, and we have different speech apparatus. And this changes the physical form of a word. The context of a word can matter. Your mood, where you want to place emphasis when you produce a word, and your intonational patterns all change the physical manifestation of a word. And as adults, we sort of hear through this. We don't think too much about it. But as we'll see, for infants, it can pose a real challenge. So in other words, words that are the same often sound different. And how do infants capture relevant sound changes? And how do they learn to disregard changes that may be rampant in the signal but don't change the meaning of a word? So I'll illustrate this by presenting the stimulus for a study that we're currently doing, which is looking at lexical tone. So this is a study where infants they learn a novel word, they're taught the meaning of a new word, and the idea is they would make an association between this novel word and its label. And there are two videos. In the first video, the child is taught a novel word in English context in English, and then the child sees two test trials. In the first test trial, the child tested on whether they've learned that word with a correct pronunciation of the word they've been trained on. In the second test trial, they hear a tonal shift. So they hear the same word, but it changes in tone. And then there's a Mandarin video where they're trained on another novel word, and again they see a test trial with a correct pronunciation, that's a repetition, and then a tonal shift. And what you can see is that the child's challenge, if they're an English Mandarin bilingual, is to take account of tone changes in Mandarin, but to sort of disregard them in English. So the way in which we do these kinds of studies is not by asking children or asking infants, but by monitoring their eye movement. So looking at where they visually fixate during a test trial. So like many of the methods in infant and toddler cognition, you have to sort of probe listening using observable tools, so using looking or head turns. So you can see in this video the stimulus presentation, but you can also see the child, and it's difficult to tell whether there are differences between the child's fixation to correct pronunciations and mispronunciations, because the differences are in order of milliseconds. From the computer. I don't think it's playing from the speaker.
So happy to see you, Elizabeth. It was a bright and sunny day. Lily was home with no one to play with. Just then, she saw her friend Elizabeth. Hello, Elizabeth.
Hello,
Hello, Lily. What are you doing here? I'm so happy to see you, Elizabeth. I'm bored. Would you like to play? Sure. I just got home from school and I really want to play. Great. Do you remember my birthday party on Sunday? I got this new toy from my mummy and a clapper from my daddy. Shall we play with them? Okay, that sounds great. This is my clapper. I'll show you how to play with a clapper. This clapper is really fun. Wow, I would love to have one too. Here is my other toy. I'll show you how to play with it too. It's very interesting. Cool. Do you want to go to the playground to play with them? Okay, that's a great idea. Which one is the clapper? That's pretty. Which one is the clapper? That's pretty.圣诞节快到了，莉莉决定到玩具店买一个玩具给她的弟弟。在玩具店时，她看见了惠山。惠山，你好。莉莉，你好。你在这里做什么？我在找一个圣诞礼物给我弟弟。惠山，你要帮我选一个礼物吗？圣诞节吗？我最喜欢圣诞节了。你找到了什么？我看到了这个玩具，也找到了这个笔谱。你觉得好吗？两个都很可爱呀。你看这个笔谱，这个笔谱看起来很有趣。你喜不喜欢这个笔谱？是啊，它看起来真的很好玩。那这另一个玩具呢？这个玩具看起来也很好玩，我想现在就玩它。不知道弟弟会喜欢哪一个玩具？不然你先买下这两个玩具，我们可以先试试，然后再决定。好主意，让我先付钱，然后我们可以去我家玩。找那个笔谱，你看到吗？找那个笔谱，你看到吗？
Okay, so I put this up as an illustration of the methods that are used in early language, but also of the problems confronting a bilingual child, that they have to take account, incorporate certain kinds of information like tone in a Mandarin context, and they have to disregard that in English context. So in some cases, cues that languages use to convey meaning can be inconsistent, and this can be present a challenge to a young learner. So when do children begin to demonstrate that they can identify words and retain words that they've heard? And how can this knowledge be revealed? So as I mentioned, you can't ask children directly. You have to find ways to uncover knowledge that they have about language using less direct methods. So one common method used for young children is the head-turn preference procedure. And the head-turn preference procedure essentially turns an unobservable response, so listening, into observable behavior, so turning your head and fixating on a visual stimulus. So one of the ways in which the head-turn preference procedure has been adapted to look at language is by training infants on novel words when they're quite young, so when they're 6 months old and onwards, and then testing them on whether they have encoded, retained those words, and whether they can demonstrate that they recognize those words in the context of larger units or sentences. So I'll go through this with an illustration. So in the head-turn preference procedure, an infant sits with their parent in a 3-walled testing booth. There's a light on either side, and there's a light in the center. The center light is just an attention getter to get their attention to the midline. And the sidelights are paired with stimuli. So in the initial phase, in the training phase, infants are presented with, they're sitting in a 3-wall testing booth, and one of the sidelights begins to flash. An infant orients towards the flashing light because it's appealing, and then one of the training words is presented. So they begin to hear the word bike, for example. And the word is presented as long as the infant looks at the flashing light. So 2 things are happening here. One is that the infant is hopefully listening to and encoding a word. And the second thing is that infants are learning that there's an association between their response and stimulus presentation. So it's an infant-controlled procedure. So you can use this procedure to train infants on novel words, or words that may be novel for them. So unfamiliar words are also words that exist in their language. So let's take bike and hat, for example. And when they've accrued a certain amount of training time or familiarization time, you can change the stimulus to consist of sentences. So they hear some sentences that contain these words they were trained on, and some sentences that contain words that they were not trained on. And you look for differentials in listening times or visual fixation times to these 2 kinds of sentences. And from that you can make an inference about whether infants have identified words that they were trained on during the familiarization phase. So I'll present a video of this procedure. So this is just a small clip of a few trials.
Have a seat. Hi, Sylvia. Okay, so this is let's see, baby's looking at these 3 lights. She's sitting here with her dad. Okay, so the baby's sitting with her dad on his lap, and pretty soon she's going to start hearing words being played out of speakers from either side of her, on the other side of the wall.
Bike, 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 bike. Hat, 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 hat. Hat, 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 hat. She liked how the hat covered her ears. Her brother. She put on her hat to play in the snow. The hat was soft and warm. He liked to look outside at the tree. The tree was 100 years old. Hanging from the tree was a swing. The man's grandchild played in the tree.
Okay. So of course you can't choreograph these things. Unfortunately, this child is listening longer to the passages that contain the novel words compared to the passages that contain the words she was trained on. But you can adapt this procedure to look at the effects of variability on word knowledge. So what kinds of things make it easy for infants to identify words, and what kinds of things make it difficult for infants to identify words. So for example, infants can hear one word with a high pitch or in a happy voice, and one word in a low pitch or with a neutral voice. And it turns out that these surface differences that don't change the meanings of words exert important influences on how children fare at this task. So looking at a variety of different sources of variability, it seems that when infants are 7 to 8 months of age, when they're beginning to show evidence of being able to identify words, it throws them off quite significantly to have changes in talker gender, emotion, focusing, stress, and pitch. So, for example, if a word is familiarized by a male voice and then later presented in a female voice, infants are not able to do this task. Or if a word is familiarized in a happy tone of voice and later in a neutral tone of voice, then they are not able to do this task. But by around 10 to 11 months, infants seem to outgrow these limitations and can generalize across different exemplars of words. So I was interested in looking at what happens for bilingual children and how good are they at this young age at switching between the phonological rules of different